Hello, all, and welcome to Essence of Wonder. On today's shows on Legends of Marketing, we're going to talk about Harry Potter, Star Wars, current e-publishing, and various other things that are pretty cool in my book. I've been working along with the team on this episode for quite some time, and I'm truly excited to have you here. Today, joining me as co-host will be Margaret Hazelwood. She's pretty amazing. She's been very active in our community for quite some time now. She's a writer, a blogger, a vlogger, or vlogger. How do you call this? I'm not really even sure. Maybe Morgan can help me out there. How do I say that, Morgan?
Vlogger.
Vlogger. Okay, awesome. And you now have your own kind of podcast thing going on as well. If I am not entirely mistaken, you can find it at morganhazelwood.fireside.fm. And you're supposed to say, yes, Gadi, that is exactly where you can find it so everybody knows.
morganhazelwood.fireside.fm.
Well, there you go. So I appreciate you joining us today. Your knowledge of marketing and how it works, especially for writers, is something that I've personally learned from a lot. And I truly appreciate you joining us and helping us getting this moving today.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. Although I haven't actually made any money from my marketing, I've definitely put myself out there, and I'm comfortable with at least the basics.
I find, thank you for your humility. I will humiliate you then and say that I did learn from you, and I made no money from this either. I actually find that marketing is a spend. Do you find you need to keep spending or avoid spending or giving yourself excuses to not spend money on marketing?
Well, between the amount of time and the amount of, there's another platform I could be on. How much does that cost? And it just keeps snowballing very slowly.
I found when I was CEO of a startup for a while, and I found that every VP of marketing I tried to bring on would immediately try to hire 12 more people. And I was like, why? This is a startup. We should be working on this and trying to get things rolling until I tried to do it myself. And it's just an endless sink of resources. It's truly impressive how much time you can spend on this and not be done.
It definitely is. Every time you think you've got a handle on it and you've got a system worked out, you think of something else, or you find another audience that you might be missing.
Yep. I can agree with that. And I think we can just move on to talking to the masters who are with us today.
Definitely.
And joining us first will be Craig Miller. I first met Craig, I believe, on the Smoth's mailing list or something around that or similar to that. And maybe first time we actually met in person was in 2007 SmothCon? Was it then, Craig, do you think?
Something like that.
Something like that. Well, Craig, as being the go-to expert on anything Hollywood for a long, long time in our community. And he also has a pretty impressive background. For example, he was heading fan relations for Lucasfilm between 77 and 80. He created and oversaw the official Star Wars fan club. He produced the Star Wars Sesame theme episodes. And I also think you operated the R2-D2 head, right? That was you?
Yeah. Well, sometimes I operated R2's head. Sometimes I operated his body.
Fair enough. Wait, there were two people doing this?
Yeah. It took, back then, technology wasn't as good, and it took two people to operate R2.
Oh, wow. And you also have your book, Star Wars Memories, coming up when you talk about all your years working on Star Wars.
Indeed. It's out now through Amazon.
It seems to me, if we're to skip right into it, that community is the buzzword now and for the past decade. It's all about forming these communities, working with communities, and all the way back then, working on a movie and already having communities out there and having the foresight, something like that, to actually do something about it, form these relations, work up towards Star Wars with these relations. How did it work? What made you even start doing that?
Charlie Lippincott was the vice president of marketing and advertising for Lucasfilm. And he knew that he had a movie that had no named stars in it, no one who was really popular in the United States, no one you could book on The Tonight Show or other talk shows. And science fiction was not a popular genre in the 70s. So he came up with the idea of marketing directly to the target audience, that is science fiction, comic book fans, all that sort of thing. and I ended up consulting with him on the marketing of Star Wars to fans prior to it coming out, and then once it came out, I was brought in on staff full time to continue that.
You have that evil look of. Is that the cat over there?
Yes, yeah, I have a cat who is very clingy today, and so he just
We're not
wants
complaining.
to be on me.
What's his name?
This cat is named Slinky.
Slinky. Does that mean you have more than one?
Yeah, we actually have 3. It's quite possible another one will show up and sit on the back of the chair. She likes to do that. The third one won't be in here. She stays in her part of the house.
Fair enough. So let me ask you, what did you guys do to build that community-based marketing? How did you guys make it happen?
Well, primarily we started with going to conventions. In that case, in Star Wars case, we went to WesterCon, which is the Western Regional Convention. That was in LA in '76. We went to San Diego Comic-Con, and we went to the World Science Fiction Convention in Kansas City that year. And then we continued doing other conventions, but those were the main ones. And we reached out to the fan community. We reached out to opinion makers, is the industry term. We went to bookstores, comic book shops, got them to put up promotional material, worked with magazines like Starlog and Cinefantastique and even Famous Monsters to get them to run things, stuff that was targeted specifically to the audience we wanted to reach. And then built from there, continued that relationship. I mean, I was there for 3 years after Star Wars opened, working on continuing Star Wars outreach and then Empire Strikes Back. And that was maintaining our relationship with fans and what we now call the fan community. And then doing things like the Marvel Comics licensing deal, the Star Wars novelization, and a spin-off novel, all that kind of stuff was maintaining and reaching out to the audience that we thought would be the core audience for it.
So going the comics route, for example, wasn't so much about merchandising, it was to maintain that momentum?
Yeah, I mean, the comics route was all of the early merchandising. Of course, you want to make money. I mean, no one's going to deny that there was a monetary interest, but it was all reaching out to the people who might go to the movie and getting to them beforehand. The novel or the novelization came out, I think, the end of 1976. The Marvel Comics started with a 6-part adaptation of the first movie, and those first 3 issues came out in March, April, and May. So just before the movie came out, to try to reach that audience and make them interested and excited about going to the movie. So, I mean, everything, especially back then, was tied to getting people into the theaters to buy tickets to the movie.
So once you had that first movie come out and with this success, was it easier to grow for excitement for the next movie? Did you expand your operations or just double down on the connections you'd already built?
No, we expanded as much as we could. Obviously, it's easier to sell something when people know what it is you're talking about and know they like the first version.
Right.
Before Star Wars, people had very low opinions of science fiction. After Star Wars, if you asked people, they still didn't like science fiction, but they liked Star Wars. So we could build on that. And that's why we did things like putting R2 and 3PO on episodes of Sesame Street. We did a phone line you could call in and get messages from Luke and Han and Leia and C-3PO and Darth Vader. We did all kinds of outreach. We kept going to conventions, of course, and we maintained the relationships we had, but we definitely built on it. And now being a known commodity, people were more interested in finding out about it and getting involved.
Right. So how did you decide which of these different outreaches were more productive? How did you know which ones were succeeding? And was there any way to tell that, oh, Sesame Street was a great market, but maybe next time don't spend our money on the call-ins or whatever?
Oh, no, that's much more sophisticated than anything we were doing. We did stuff and it's like, seems like it works. Sesame Street was the #1 show for kids. Kids were a big audience, not necessarily preschool kids, but kids were a big audience. And the other thing is a lot of what we did didn't cost very much money. TV ads cost a lot of money. Sesame Street cost us we didn't pay Sesame Street. We said, would you like to have R2 and 3PO on episodes? And they were like, cool. So our costs were bringing Tony Daniels in from London to be 3PO, shipping the radio-controlled R2. I had a 4-person team who went with me, and so we're all under salary, so it didn't cost anything for our salaries. It just cost, flying us to New York and putting us up in a hotel for a few days. So that's very cheap. The phone messages we did, which were enormously successful in terms of publicity. The volume was so high, and back then phone switching was mechanical, not electronic. So it's located, we had a particular phone number that was located in Illinois, 521-1980, which was May 21st, 1980. It was an 800 number, and you wanted 521, you were in Illinois. The response was so great that we shut down the 800 phone system to the state of Illinois because AT&T couldn't process all of the calls.
Wow.
Ours became the big event, like they prepared today for the Super Bowl, saying we're going to be overwhelmed.
Yeah, and we had done no advertising. It was announced in Starlog and at a few conventions. So AT&T wanted us to seesaw advertising, which was easy, add more phone lines, which was easy. That just cost a little bit of money.
Ask for more money, essentially.
And then they threw us into the briar patch, if you will. They said, we want you to apologize publicly for this shutdown because they didn't want their customers to blame them. And I was like, no problem. Okay. And so we sent out a press release saying, we're so sorry that there are that many Star Wars fans eager to find out about The Empire Strikes Back 5 months before the movie comes out, that it overwhelmed the AT&T system. But don't worry, it's all fixed and now you could call.
So that's where all the condom advertisement, they stole it from you. The condom advertising must have stolen it from you then, saying that, if you have problems after 4 hours, go to the hospital. It's a warning, but it's advertising, right?
And
no,
so
I'm going too far on this one, and my wall thing came off. Go on.
But we got very little general publicity out of the phone line. It was something we were doing to entertain fans and keep them interested. But once we had to send out that press release, which was picked up everywhere, well, that was great. That was better than advertising.
But that's actually, I would like to stop there for a second. It seems like once you had momentum building on it, everything worked. Press release and the phone lines. when I'm thinking about your role, going to these conventions, talking to fans about something they apparently did not believe in, how did you engage? How did you get the fans to talk about Star Wars, to let you come on stage and talk about it?
Well, conventions were pretty good about Hollywood wants to come here. That was not something. Today, movie companies are all over science fiction conventions, especially the big ones like Dragon Con and San Diego Comic-Con. Back then, no film company had ever done that before. Star Wars was the first one to ever go to a convention, and they were open to it. Now, the reaction we got at these conventions, pretty much universally, because on Star Wars, we showed slides and Ralph McQuarrie paintings and what filming had been done, and told the story of Star Wars, not all the way through, but a lot of it. And the reaction we got, even from science fiction fans, was, this sounds great if they can only make a good movie. We'll have to wait and see. Because everyone was used to the kind of science fiction movies that had been coming out in the 70s. But we got them interested. We got them wanting to see what was out there. We got them interested. And it's a word of mouth type of marketing, which is enormously successful, because people who care enough about a topic, whether it's science fiction or hot rod racing or experimental airplanes, whatever, talk about it a lot. And even their friends or coworkers who aren't really into it, but know they're into it, will ask them about it. Hey, I heard about this science fiction movie. Do you know anything about it? Oh, well, let me tell you about it. You've got people all over the place doing your marketing for you. Just like with novels, word of mouth. I read this new book. You tell your friend, or someone asks, what's a good book about thus and such? You're spreading the word. It's great marketing because it's personal and it's real. It's not just a TV commercial, which are useful, but they're not as big in terms of motivating as someone saying they're interested.
I see. Well, do you find that communities have shifted today when you're trying to do a community approach?
Yes and no. The internet is the big difference. We had no internet. We had to go to people. We had to reach out to them. And the biggest mass marketing we could do was magazines like Starlog. Because conventions are only in the 4-digit attendance at the best. Comic-Con in 1976 was like 4,000 people, not 150,000 people. So the internet is a much bigger platform for building and accelerating those communities.
I find from my own experience, when I look at the internet, that it's true that we have more reach to people, but it's also sometimes, in the modern world, when you can slice and find a specific audience that you want, I still find it's more difficult in a way than what it was back then, because back then it was a captive audience. If you went to a science fiction convention, you went to the leaders in their local communities, who then went back to their own cities and talked about things. And today, you're competing openly on the open market with everybody else trying to reach them.
Sure, it's like all marketing. You have to have something to sell. You have to have a way that makes you stand out. Why is my movie better than all the other movies? Why is my laundry detergent better than all the laundry detergents?
And at some point, you have 200 laundry detergents out there, and you can no longer advertise. So a community approach.
No, just the opposite. You have to advertise, because when people go into a supermarket and see an entire aisle of the same shaped bottle in different colors, and they don't have a brand they've been using since they were 4 years old and their mother was using it, they walk in and go, Ajax, I've heard of that one. It must be good. That's what advertising is doing. It's putting the name and the product in your head, and it helps convince you to buy that one and not some other one. That's a major aspect of mass market advertising.
Do you find that you have... Actually, hold on. Before I continue, Morgan, do you have something you want to put in here?
I was just going to comment that you have to keep them sold on what you've already sold them on. But I was just going to ask, I was curious, if you were going to go about pitching and spreading the word for Star Wars in an environment that was as open to sci-fi today as it was back in the 70s when you actually launched it, but with the technology of today, how would you do it differently?
Well, not that this is unique, but you have your own websites, but you also reach out. You go to the different existing communities, and you can't do it as an outsider. You have to, I mean, you can, but I think you get the best results if you have people who are on those Facebook groups, who are in those Instagram groups, who are in those communities, and they act as your intermediaries, or you have your own people who start taking part in these various communities. You can't wait till, oh, your movie's going to open next week and you start reaching out. It's got to be something. We started marketing Star Wars to fans 9 months, actually 10 months before Star Wars came out. After I left Lucasfilm and I was an independent consultant to Disney and Warner's and Jim Henson and a lot of places, we typically started 8 to 12 months in advance, even without dealing with the internet, to build up that interest in the product, the movie. You know, it's something you have to work on, and it's something that takes time. I think it's the same with books. I've been marketing my book, Star Wars Memories, and that, you know, I joined a lot of Star Wars groups that, you know, I'm not famous. I'm more famous now that the book is out than I was then, but I'm someone whose credentials are solid. And so people were willing and interested in hearing what I had to say. And I could promote, and after I'd been there for a while, I could promote my book into those groups. And I think the same is true. It's just like, you know, any science fiction reading group on the internet, and Goodreads and all that sort of thing. If you come off as, I'm the Madison Avenue marketer, no one cares. If you're a real person, they want to hear your opinion.
So authenticity and being a fan of the thing you're pushing, not just spamming the account and moving on.
Right. I think that's a big part of it. Even with Star Wars, when we did the World Science Fiction Convention, there was a lot of negativity in the audience. Oh, you were gonna get science fiction wrong. You know, science fiction has this whole hard science fiction thing where they want to see the rivets and know how your faster than light drive works, and that kind of thing. But
magic. That's how it works.
Well, but that's it. Gary Kurtz said, we're not doing hard science fiction. This is science fantasy. This is E.E. Doc Smith. And he named a few known adventure science fiction writers. And the audience responded very favorably. Now he wasn't just the producer of Star Wars. He was a guy who actually knew about science fiction. He had read these authors. He knew the approach they were taking and going at it that way. They weren't people who disdained the field and were just doing it because they thought they could make a buck.
At this stage, I would like to invite any of our upcoming panelists. I think only Dave is with us right now. and see if you have. Dave actually, I believe, wrote Star Wars books later on, and helped you continue that immense machine of maintaining the Star Wars brand. Dave, how are you doing today with being muted? So I keep talking until I see the mute button. Oh, there we go. Hi, Dave. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
When you wrote the Star Wars books that you did you get any sort of branding requirements or something that will fit the whole machine there, like Craig is talking about, or you just wrote it?
With me, the way that it happened was my editor called me and said, "Would you be interested in doing a Star Wars book?" And I was a huge Star Wars fan. I had watched the first episode, episode 4 now. I'd watched the first movie probably 30 times. So I had memorized the script basically. And so when they asked me to do it, I was happy and excited. And they didn't give me too much in requirements. They just said, make sure you don't say anything bad about any of the characters. So it wasn't too hard. They allowed me to do my own storylines and things like that. And I loved working with Lucasfilm.
Do you have any responses or questions or ideas hearing what Craig is saying?
Listening to Craig, I think it's really fascinating. Starlog magazine, as I recall, the very first episode had basically was a Star Wars themed episode, if I remember right, and they went on and did quite well. They actually had a Star Wars magazine that branched off after Star Wars came into being. And so a lot of what they were doing was just a lot of heavy lifting, a lot of legwork in order to start building a fandom at a time when things were pretty grim for science fiction fans. You didn't admit that in public. In particular, what impressed me was that Craig talks about going and doing things on Sesame Street. Now, if you listen to the dialogue on Sesame Street before Star Wars came out, they were kind of anti-science fiction sometimes. And it changed markedly after Craig and Lucasfilm went in and talked to them, so that we ended up with a geek culture. 30 years later, all of a sudden, these kids that were watching Sesame Street grew up and they started going to major conventions and saying,
I'm going to stop you right there. Craig, this is a quote right here. What you have done has caused there to be geeks 30 years later. How do you respond to this allegation, sir?
I'm not sure let's just say I am too humble to say that is true. I think there's some validity to it, but I think there's a lot of other things that worked in that direction.
Yeah, I think it definitely it's a combination of factors. I would look at things like Star Trek too, and the acceptance of science fiction on TV in particular. If you want to look at I'm not going to go into them because we could go into a lot of different things. But this was a turning point. I think it was definitely a stepping stone.
Yeah, a very large percentage of the population, if you ask them, would say they didn't like science fiction. And a lot of into the 1980s, they started doing science fiction TV shows, War of the Worlds, and all kinds of things. But they'd always say, "Oh, it isn't science fiction; it's science fact," because they'd want to try to distance themselves from science fiction. And I remember telling the War of the Worlds guys, not War of the Worlds, it was some other show, but it was going to another planet. And I said, you get in a rocket, you go to another planet, you meet aliens, you've crossed the line. It's science fiction.
Well, we do have a question from the audience, I think, Morgan, right?
Yeah, so Chase in our audience has the question, given the recent COVID-enhanced shift to digital, do you think that media consumers are becoming more price sensitive to projects, and how do you expect that this will be changing the marketing, i.e. the Mulan effect or what have you?
I think things change constantly. Obviously, COVID has been a major shift, but I don't think it, I mean, it changes the marketing because we can't do in-person stuff to large groups. But um, it it's basically everything is the internet now, and it's the way distribution works. Okay, you're in the 70s we weren't selling home video. Then in the 80s we started selling home video as well as theatrical. Now it's streaming. Now it's buy first run movies on TV. We'll see what happens with Mulan. I think $30 is too high of a ticket price. Um, but it's a change. It's not the basics. It's not, marketing is marketing is marketing. The methodology shifts, the location of it shifts, but it's still convincing people that this is something they want to spend money on.
Right. Do you think that because of the COVID effect and fewer things are actively being released, that might help more so than it might if everyone was used to this sort of delivery method?
Well, the fewer things there are to buy, the greater chance they'll buy yours. Once the market becomes flooded, it becomes harder. It's
Right.
just like all these streaming services we have. Every television network, the broadcast networks have streaming versions. All the studios are doing their own streaming versions. I just don't see those surviving very long because people aren't going to want to pay $5 or $10 a month for 27 different streaming services. Disney has the product. Netflix has the product. Amazon is going to have the product. But, I don't see a lot of the others staying around just because you're not going to be able to sell enough to make it profitable. But, of course, I could be wrong too. But no, I just think yes, of course, right now there are fewer choices. Each one's bigger. It's like audiences in the days when there were only the three major networks and a couple of local stations. The major networks had 90% of the TV viewers because you didn't have any other options really. Now they still have the majority, but it's like 50% or 40%.
It's kind of like smelling the blood in the water and the sharks coming in, watching that kind of thing up. It's kind of like the post year 2000 startup e-commerce thing, dry up killing zone, whatever you want to call it. We have Ed coming up in a second, and he's also going to talk to us about marketing and producing and Star Wars. And I was just wondering to ask you one final question. As you look at the way you just approached Sesame Street, right, and you started going to all these conventions and targeting your audience, these things were not unheard of, but certainly not executed on back then. And I wonder if there is something that you've learned since that you would have added to the mix today, if you could go back.
I'd say I've learned a lot in the last 40 years.
No, really? I'm asking for one thing.
But I know it's hard to say. I mean, obviously, you have to use the internet. You have to, as we discussed earlier, not just your own website, but all the different groups, because that's where the audience is. The people who have an interest. Go to them. And that's what we did with Star Wars. And then suddenly everyone else was doing it, going to the audience.
Makes sense. And it did change the world. Thank you very much for joining us, Craig. And if you have the time, of course, feel free to join us again later. You know what? I will get in one last question, if you don't mind. Morgan, maybe, I think Morgan has one, so I can't actually have mine. But Morgan, please go ahead.
Sure. There was one more question from the audience. What is the figurine in the box behind you, Mr. Miller?
Okay.
Which box?
Which box? There are two large Iron Giant figures behind me
Okay.
that you could probably only see the bottom parts of. One is a Saw figure and one's like a giant action figure. And in the wooden box that they're sitting on is actually a large spaceship miniature.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Craig. And I hope to see you a little bit later as well.
Okay.
And with that, I would, of course, ask Ed to join us. I will, of course, introduce Ed, and this is also great for us to kind of coordinate behind the scenes as people try to unmute themselves and all the other things that Zoom kind of wants us to do. And the thing about Ed has been in the Hollywood business for so many years. He has had 12 years, the last 24 years, I believe. Maybe I even missed a few, counting all of them. He's worked on big ones like the Oscar-nominated Anna and the King, and he's worked on Star Wars, and honestly, he's just immensely knowledgeable, and I'm very happy to have him with us here today. Hi, Ed. How are you doing?
We're doing good. Although when you say immensely knowledgeable, I look around and try and figure out who you really should be referring to. But
your twin brother, of course.
If I had one, that would be him. Yes. So fire away. What can I tell you?
Well, you can tell us so much, but to try and seg from the previous segment, maybe we can start with Star Wars. A little bit about the advertising over there and how you saved the day.
I would not claim to have saved the day.
That's my claim. You never said it. It's just my claim here, and I'm sticking to it.
But I played a role in the opening. I had I'd gone to work at Fox. Found myself in the distribution department. They didn't really have a marketing department back then. They didn't actually know what the word meant. Shopping for dinner. And but they did have an advertising department. They did have a public relations department, a PR department, and distribution. And in between all of that was a giant hole. There was one guy over there who didn't quite fit. His name was Ashley Boone. Ashley, who passed away at a very young age, was their first black executive, and something of a star, something of a celebrity in his own right. He had come over from Motown, where he had been responsible for bullying, what's his name, the founder of Motown into releasing the album What's Going On, which was a transformative album in music at that time. And he was now at Fox, and he was working in distribution because they, as the closest they had to a marketing executive. And I became his intern. Not intern, I'm sorry, I became his protege, I guess is what you would call it. But he didn't know what to do with me any more than they knew what to do with him. We were marketing guys, both of us. I had been a marketing executive at Fortune 100 companies before then, which was a world in which they did understand what marketing was. And here they had these two big films coming out at roughly the same time. One was called, I think it was The Other Side of Midnight, based on a potboiler novel that had been one of the it wasn't Irving Wallace, I forgot who it was, Harold Robbins, perhaps, one of those guys. And they had Star Wars. And they were not very confident about Star Wars. A lot of them didn't think it would be successful. They had they really didn't know what to do with it. And that was one of a handful of films that I was assigned to as the project officer or project coordinator to, they weren't even quite sure what I was doing, but to allegedly coordinate distribution, domestic distribution, with the PR and advertising departments that they did understand, because they could look at the images of the advertising. So it was about 6 months ahead of the release of the film. Fox really had no idea what to do with it. They had no idea what to expect. They had no notion of it being a catalytic film. Their notion of science fiction films was Robbie the Robot, and so they handed it to me as one of a handful of films that I was supposed to do something with, just what they weren't clear. And I looked at this film and I thought it was the most remarkable film I'd ever seen. And I looked at the trailer that they had done, and it was exceptional as well. This was the first trailer. And so I went to Ashley, who was my boss. He was VP of, I guess, marketing is what they call him. And I said, this is killer. We can be the biggest film of all time. Let's do the one thing that we don't need to ask for money to do. Because after all, since they didn't really understand what marketing was, they didn't have a budget for it. I said, look, we're going to release this film on hundreds of theaters. And that, I think, was largely because Francis Ford Coppola was behind Lucas at the time, and he was using his muscle to push the importance of the project within the studios. So it was going to get a first-class release in terms of numbers of theaters, but they weren't doing much of anything to promote it, and they didn't typically do anything to promote films before they put them out on their, I won't call it circuit, but back then and up until maybe, I don't know, a few years ago, all of the majors, all of the studios had their own allocation of screens by the major exhibitors, meaning that if you were a Universal or Warner's or whatever, you had a certain number of major releases each year, and the exhibitors, which were in a reciprocal relationship with you, the studios, understood that they had to give you a certain number of screens for those big releases. And so whether you call that each studio's allocation or each studio's release circuit, whatever it was, we knew that we were going to be playing on hundreds of screens. The typical use of trailers at that time was to drop, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 trailers into the theaters that were going to be receiving the film anywhere from a week to a month ahead of the release of the film. So, for example, if your principal screen in Los Angeles was going to be one of the man theater screens, you might get one or two of the other theaters in Los Angeles, plus the theater that was going to receive the movie, playing that trailer a couple of weeks ahead of time. And I said, this is crazy. We have a frequent moviegoer. The kids are going to eat this up. Let's just do something that no one's ever really done. And thinking back, I'm not entirely sure no one had ever done it. I have a vague memory that I saw sometime 40, 50 years in the past, they would do this sort of a thing. So I said, let's just have 500, 600 trailers. Get them out there and get them out there 6 months ahead of time. Because these are your frequent moviegoers. And this is free, too. You didn't have to pay to put a trailer up. So if you had 6 or 7 or 8 or 3 or 4 major chains, and every one of those chains nationally was going to have a certain number of release dates for this film, I figured we'd just go to each chain and we'd say, look, just put them up on all of the screens within a certain radius of where that one play date is going to be. So St. Louis, if St. Louis was going to have 3 or 4 play dates of Star Wars on the opening, I said, let's look at who those theater chains are. Usually it would just be one theater chain in St. Louis, 1 or 2, and let's get them to put these trailers up on all 30 of their screens 6 months ahead of time. They didn't know what I was talking about. No one had done that in recent years, if ever. And then I told the branches of Fox, look, we'll make you up some T-shirts, wrap the trailers in the T-shirts as a gift for the projectionist, so that he will or she will do us the favor. It was all he then. He'll do us the favor of getting that trailer up. And somehow we got 500-600 trailers up 6 months ahead. The studio flipped out, but not in a good way. They had a new senior vice president of market research that I think had come over from Bristol Myers, and he did some focus groups and came back freaked out saying, adults hate the movie. And I was ordered to pull all of those trailers off, all those hundreds of trailers. I went to Ashley and I said, this is crazy. It's not an adult audience. It's a youth audience. And this thing is going to be the biggest film of all time. I want to leave the trailers up. And tell them that I took them down, because they don't go to the theaters to check anyway, so they wouldn't know the difference. He said, all right, here's the deal. You go do that. If you are I agree with you. If in the end you're right, you know that I'll be taking most of the credit for it. If in the end you're wrong, you'll be fired. I said I could care less. You know, when you're young, you don't care. And about a month later, they ran back to us saying, we were wrong. Can you get those trailers back up? And of course I said, yeah, it won't take but a minute, because I never took them down. And then at a point I decided we had a second trailer, and I decided to replace all of those first trailers with the new trailer, on the theory that now that we have an audience, a frequent movie-going audience that has seen this trailer, we knew the kids loved it, we would essentially continue the storyline, as it were, by moving to the next trailer. It wasn't that the trailers were trying to tell the storyline sequentially. They were just different points of view or different cuts of some of the same content that had been pulled from the movie. So at that point, we were really, what would the word be? We were tracking high. People knew about this movie. They were excited about it. And at that point, since I wasn't going to be fired, I had a little bit more wriggle room to pull something else. So I decided, wouldn't it be great if 2 weeks ahead of the release of the film, we take one of the films that's playing nationwide, one of the Fox films that's playing nationwide, take the 8 p.m. or 7:30 p.m. Saturday night screening, and make that into a preview. And what that meant we would be substituting Star Wars for that film, so that the audience could buy those preview tickets. The distribution was against it, because what that meant was that whatever film was supposed to be playing that Saturday night that was going to be replaced by Star Wars, the entire gross for that showing had to be paid to the movie that was bumped. And Fox hated the idea of paying revenues for a screening of a movie that wasn't in fact screened at that time, because at that point in time, and probably still to this day, it was anathema for a studio to pay profits on any movie. I think in 1976, the studio publicized their 26 movies that they were releasing that year. When they had meetings with exhibitors, and they did a fancy brochure called 26 for 76. I remember a year later, I ran the numbers because I was still at Fox, and discovered that 25 of those 26 movies had actually gone into profit for Fox, but only one of them had gone into profit from the point of view of the profit participants. So it was just it was something you never did. You'd never wanted to pay profits to the participants of movies, but nevertheless they agreed. And so we did a nationwide sneak 2 weekends before the opening, that Saturday night, and it was so phenomenally successful that they agreed to do the same thing the following weekend, which was the weekend before the release of the film. I think the film was released on a Wednesday. I could be wrong, but so the Saturday before that and the Saturday before that, we did these sneaks on hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of screens, following that massive 6-month onslaught of trailers. And no one had ever done these things before, or at least that I was aware of. It was no surprise to Ashley and me that the film opened with the biggest opening in history in the film industry. Tons of people played a part, starting with the people who made the film, people who fought for the film. I was just the tail end of I was at the tail end of the dog, I guess. But that was my involvement with it.
Fair enough. It's when we spoke before, and thank you for that story, by the way. When we spoke before, you mentioned that while you're a marketing executive, the one thing, how did you say this? The one thing you did whenever marketing came up was essentially leave the room or try not to hear about marketing or try not to do marketing. What was that?
I don't remember saying that.
I caught you on tape. No, I'm kidding. So, having been in marketing for so many years, joking aside, do you feel that, what was your aha moment around that? Like, you've done so many new things there, right? Because of an opportunity at the tail end of the marketing. Do you feel that the movie industry has learned from that? What was different? Craig mentioned earlier, as we were talking, that it's always about getting in front of the audience. It's always about finding that way to make yourself unique.
Mm-hmm.
And
you're right. You
made things unique there. What was different? How would you do it today?
So did so many other people at that time. It was more of a village back then. Craig, I think you'd probably echo this. You could try things out. You could get away with things. It was the movie industry in general. Using the word industry really stretched the meaning of it. It was a small town, and it was a small town with a lot of people up top who either didn't want to do anything differently or didn't want to do anything that wasn't different. And there was a culture clash there, but it was a period of change. And there were hot spots where the change was occurring fastest. Lucasfilm was one of them, where you had really creative people who also understood business and who would get up and somehow convince the others. I worked for a stretch as VP of marketing for a director who has been gone for some time, named Robert Altman. But we would every so often we would go to the head of the studio. It was Alan Ladd Jr. at the time, and what he would claim to do, what Bob Altman would claim to do, would be although he didn't do it physically because he would have broken the table, would be to get up on Alan Ladd's coffee table and dance. So it was about creative people, whether on the marketing side or on the narrative side, somehow persuading either the old line executives who weren't as brilliant as the founders of Hollywood, or the business people who had been brought in, who had no idea what was going on, to take risks. And back then it was a climate where people were willing to take risks because they weren't answerable to boards of directors in New York or the stock price. You got away with a lot more, Craig. I don't know about you, but I could never get away with that stuff today if I was at a studio.
Maybe it's a good time for us to actually get everybody together. Dave, Craig, Morgan, would you like to get us started?
I'm sorry. I wanted one more question for Ed before we opened up. I was just curious, from an outsider perspective, I'm not fully aware of the differences between PR and marketing. Could you speak a little bit to that?
Well, you're probably more aware of them than the executives were back then. And then you could also get into the issue of what is PR and what's public relations.
Wait, they're not the same thing?
I hear people claim that they are, and I hear people claim that they're not. There are facets of marketing and there are facets of PR. I would say that marketing is an umbrella term that deals with the interface between the product and the audience. And it's a two-way interface. It's not only understanding what it is that the audience wants, it's understanding what you can about who the audience is for the product you already have, or it could be understanding the audience's needs and thinking to design a product or tailor a product to what they most would respond to. And then it's very much about finding the pathways that connect the two, that connect the audience and the product. And these have all been basically revolutionized over the last 10, 15 years. And it's been what you would call it's frequently destructive innovation. It's all disruptive. Craig was talking about doing it earlier. If every marketing is everything other than, oh my gosh, I'm out of milk. My kids are about to sit down for breakfast. I got to go out and buy milk. That's a very simple need-supply equation. When you go beyond that, it becomes what makes you want certain things and how people have created something that they think you will want, convince you that it is their product that you want. And then PR is just one of many pieces of it, which increasingly blur into one another today, while new pieces are being invented. Gadi?
Interesting. Yeah, this is an interesting distinction. I do appreciate it. So, Craig, let's start with you. Do you have something to add here, maybe, or to say?
Well, to that question, marketing is, as Ed suggested, is kind of an overall. Publicity is stuff you get for free, or essentially free. Going on Sesame Street with the robots was publicity. Buying an ad to run next to Sesame Street, although being on PBS there weren't ads, but essentially you get the idea, that's advertising. I think of public relations more in dealing with individual personalities than things like movies. And marketing also includes things like merchandising, licensing, because that's part of marketing a film or a TV show, is getting the name of your product out on merchandise in the marketplace so people see it. So that all falls under marketing.
Let me ask you something here. So I'm interested how you would make the distinction. One of the phrases I sometimes see, usually in connection with politicians is earned media, and I guess the alternative is paid media. So if, for example, you do something and you get an enormous amount of coverage for it that you don't pay for, that's, I guess that's what unearned. Do you know that? I'm not sure about the phrases, but this is an area where, for example, what you would think of as traditional advertising, when you advertise your product, in this case a candidate, costs you money, and then if you know how to manipulate the networks to get a lot of coverage, the coverage that you get that doesn't cost you money, although you don't have the same control of it, is something that can be even more important, but it's in that same category of eyeball to screen. Craig?
Yeah, I mean, there are always new terms. Transmedia was popular for a few years, maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago. But if you asked transmedia consultants, what was the best transmedia campaign ever, and I have seen this happen, they would say Star Wars. Well, transmedia did not exist back then. We weren't doing transmedia. We weren't looking at it. We were looking at how can we get the idea of going to this science fiction movie in front of people. And so we had it in toys and books and comic books. And so suddenly it was transmedia. I think earned media is kind of publicity, but doing it by news as opposed to just, actual news, breaking news, when a politician says something outrageous and they'll get covered on the news, which is a little different than publicity where you say, hey, we've cast this great star in as the new Batman.
I see that Brian has joined us here a little bit early. Hi, Brian. How are you doing? Do you have something to maybe add to this discussion?
Well, I do. When I worked as a data analyst at Geico, where a 15-minute call could save you 15% on your auto insurance, the president of the company, or the president of the marketing division, was brilliant at getting effective use of the dollars. And he did something once that I thought was amazing. Typically, when you're paying for a patch on the arm of a tennis player at, say, Wimbledon, and in this particular example, it was Wimbledon, it costs $100,000 to put it on the arm of Andre Agassi. Well, what he did is, in this particular Wimbledon, he looked at a qualifier, and a qualifier is simply somebody who has played through another tournament and made it in, but is likely to get crushed first round. And Ted was a rabid tennis fan. He followed the pros and the up-and-comers, and he knew this kid was pretty good, and he had 2 first rounds that were possible for him to get the upset, and if he won those, he would get to play Andre Agassi, presumably, on center court. The cost of that patch, saying Geico, $1,000. Well, not only did the kid win those 2 rounds, he played Agassi, primetime, Saturday night. It was a 5-set match. He upset Agassi. It made ESPN. It was the headline, and every other shot showed the Geico patch. And that was $1,000 spent versus $100,000 to be on Agassi's arm. And then, of course, that kid got to play on center court the next round because of all the publicity. And so I just thought that was an interesting, I don't know if that falls in earned or what, but it was a different way of approaching marketing, even though Geico has substantial budget.
That's foresight marketing.
Foresight marketing, there you go.
And that's a little like putting all those trailers up on screens. Wouldn't help if nobody went to the movie when the movie opened. But when the movie opened, it turned out, the luck was with us, as luck was with as luck was with that young player. What was his name?
Honestly, I don't remember. This has been 15, 16 years ago. Agassi's long since retired, but I remember watching the match, and it was pretty remarkable that, that kid ended up winning. And
so maybe it helped Geico more than it helped the player.
Well, the player was a qualifier. They typically don't earn anything. They play first round. They get beat. They get no prize money.
It got the kid $1,000.
It got him $1,000. Well, as it turned out, it got him a lot more. And I don't know what happened after that.
Yeah, if he had bought stock in well, I guess Apple wasn't around.
Well, if he had put the money, $1,000 into Berkshire Hathaway 15 years ago, he would have done very well, because at the time Berkshire owned 49% of Geico. They now, of course, own 100% of Geico.
Okay, so we do have another question. Because of different things that happen with different creators, how do you shift the marketing when one of the creators is being controversial, or you want to distance yourself from them?
Give me an example. Was the question to me or to Craig?
In general, there may have been some outcry recently over perhaps Harry Potter and its creator. So how would you go about marketing in those instances?
Well, in a way, you don't, because you've got an 800-pound gorilla who's going to tell you what the rules are. So when you've got an 800-pound gorilla, the rules of the road change. And what makes sense, could I give you stories there, but if they were ever to come out on the air, I could never.
We've only got a minute or two, so
you don't. When you have a situation like that, you generally hold your breath and hope it blows over.
Yeah,
because it's too difficult. I mean, you've already got an established. Once it's out there in the ether, once it's out in. Once it's out and you try and pull it back, that can sometimes be even worse. That's when you just point fingers and try and blame it on someone else and move on.
Yeah, you can't attack Rowling. She's too important to the property. And you can't really support Rowling's position on transgender. There's no upside for Warner Brothers or whoever's the current publisher of Harry Potter, I forget.
Scholastic, but it's probably Warner's.
Yeah, Scholastic may still be the publisher of the books. But in any case, there's no upside in dealing with it at all. You just have to hope it goes away.
Yeah, you pretend you know nothing about it and change the subject.
And on that note, we'll pretend this never happened and change the subject again. Thank you so much, Craig and Ed, and for coming up. If you have the time, of course, you're free to stay with us for later and discuss more. And on that note, I would like to acknowledge Dave Farland. Joining us today, Dave Farland, who is one of my favorite writing teachers, is a writer, author, any word you can put around it, because it's in his blood. I could even tell you a story that when he was younger, he was a not so bad painter, but he had to choose to focus somehow and do something that works for him. Is also had to choose a different name to write science fiction instead of fantasy, or fantasy instead of science fiction, all about brand that he wasn't really allowed to write. If I remember correctly, he's been on the show before, as you can tell. And lastly, he has trained a lot of the writers in the industry right now, including Brandon Sanderson and others. Hello, Dave. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic, thank you.
Thank you for being here with us. So before we get started and hear a little bit more and ask you specific and pointed questions, I do believe that at the time you helped with building Harry Potter's marketing.
Yeah, a little bit. I was working at Scholastic, and I'd been asked to write some Star Wars books. I had done middle grade novel for them, and they'd asked me to do some middle grade kind of gaming books for them for the Star Wars Adventures fan club. And I turned the first one in, and my editor, David Levithan, there said, the managing editor of the company absolutely loved that book. She said it was the best thing we've published in 32 years. And I thought that was great because it was a limited little thing that wasn't going to ever be famous. It wasn't meant for a huge audience or anything like that. It was for little kids to sit and play with the dice and play with a choose your own adventure type of game. And anyway, so I thought, well, that's great. This was in September of about 1998, I think it was. And anyway, so I turned in my second book, and I thought, well, I'm going to work really hard to make this next one even better. Now, I didn't know what a managing editor was. Different publishers have different terms for different heads of the company, and so managing editor, I figured it was somebody who made sure that the books got published and put on schedules and marketed properly and stuff like that. So anyway, after I turned in the second book, he said, she really loved this book too. And she asked if you would be willing to help us choose a book to push big for next year. And I said, yeah, sure. And so he called back a little later and he says, we're going to send you some books and you choose which one to push big. So I got a box a couple of days later, and in the box there were 30 or 40 different books. And I sat down and I looked at them, and I realized that if you want to push a book big, there weren't a lot of readers for middle grade books. It was estimated that there were 2 to 4 million readers for a middle grade book. And to push a book big, you were hoping to get more like 8 or 10 million readers. So we had to get people who normally wouldn't read this book. How do you get to a wide audience? And so I looked at it, and the first thing I decided was I wanted to look for books that could be ported into other platforms. Instead of just being a book, can it be made into a children's TV show? Could it be made into a movie? Could it be made into a video game? Because I was really big on the idea that if you really want to reach a broad audience, that's how you're going to do it. So I sat down and I took the books and I put them into piles. This one could be a movie and a video game. This one could be such and such. And my wife came in and said, what in the world are you doing? And I told her what I was doing. And she said, well, you've got a book due in 3 days. Why don't you go ahead and let me handle this? And she was absolutely right. So I said, okay. I'd like you to read these books and tell me which ones you like as an adult female, because one of the things that I was looking for was a broad audience. Would older females or older males like the book, as well as kids? I wanted something that would appeal to male, female, old, and young. And so I thought this was going to be part of the experiment anyway. And so I gave her the books that I thought could be ported into multiple media. And so she started reading Harry Potter. That night at dinner, she started telling me and the kids about it and trying to get the kids interested in reading it. And my kids would have nothing to do with it. And then the next morning at breakfast, she was telling me more about the book and how much she loved it. And I watched my 10-year-old daughter get up from the table and sneak into our bedroom and steal the book and put it in her backpack. And I thought, great, because that's the next step. I want to find out what a 10-year-old girl thinks of Harry Potter. And so she took the book to school. And when she got home from school, there was a big fight because Mom and Danielle were now fighting over the Harry Potter book. And so what happened was my mother said, you're grounded from this book until I get done reading it, since I started it first. And my wife was reading it. About 2 o'clock in the morning, I heard this scream from my daughter's room. And we'd had a burglar a couple of weeks earlier. So I grabbed a baseball bat and I rushed into her room and asked her what was going on. And she said, there's a big spider in here. and she was trembling in her bed. And so I said, well, just show it to me, and I've got a baseball bat. I'll take care of it for you. And anyway, I was ready to beat the spider senseless, and she says, no, it's in the book. And it turned out she had a flashlight, and she was reading Harry Potter in the dark, and she'd gotten to the part where there was a big spider. And then I knew she was hooked. Okay, my wife was hooked. My daughter was hooked. Female old, female young. And so then I read it. Now, there were a lot of things that I wanted to look at. Would an adult male like it? I was an adult male. Would a kid read it? I think I could judge that because I'm a good enough judge of books. And so I started reading it with all of that in mind, and fell in love with it. In fact, I decided by the end of the first chapter that she really was quite brilliant at audience analysis, probably the most brilliant writer of audience analysis that we may have seen in a generation, and if not longer. And so I was really pleased with the way it was going, but I wanted to make sure also that when I say audience analysis, I wanted to make sure that she was hitting the primary emotional appeals for people that were in the audience that she was trying to appeal to. And that included things like wonder, humor, horror, adventure, and the mystery, those major appeals. And she just nailed it. She just nailed it on that level. And then we got into, okay, how well does she do at transporting a reader into another time and another place? Because that's the key thing in finding out if a book is going to be huge in its genre. That's the number one thing that I look for. And so, getting to Hogwarts, was she able to keep her emotional appeals up so that there was still wonder even on the last of the book, that type of thing. So I looked at it from that point of view, and I said, okay, this is a great book. This is potentially a huge, huge bestseller. And I looked at the other books, and there were some good ones, but there weren't any that could be as easily marketed as Harry Potter. So I called her the next day. Actually, she called me, and I discovered, first of all, that she was the head of Scholastic. The managing editor there meant president of the company. And so I was a little bit chagrined about that. But in any case, we talked about it, and I said, Harry Potter's the book for you to push. And she says, oh, the marketing department hates that book. And I said, how could you hate Harry Potter? And she said, well, they just think it's too fat for a middle grade reader. It's too long. And so I talked to her about middle grade readers. I said, look, kids, if they love to read, they'll love reading a long book. If they don't love to read, you're not going to get them anyway. But this is a book that's going to make kids learn to love to read. And so we talked about that. And then she went on with other objections. I said, it's also written 3 grade levels too high. That's going to be difficult for you. And so we talked about Harry Potter and what I saw as being its marketable points. And she said, I agree with you. And she says, but there's a problem. She says, it's been rejected by the 12 biggest publishers in the world. And I said, editors make mistakes. You're lucky you got it. And she said, okay. She says, knowing that the 12 biggest publishers in the world have rejected it, what do you think should happen to those editors? And I said, well, if I were one of those major publishers and I found out that they had rejected this book, I'd hunt them down and fire them. And she said, that's exactly my feeling. They should all be fired. And I said, good. Okay, we're in agreement on that. So she said, I love your ideas. I think we're going to push this book big. And she said, so I'd like you to stay near the phone tomorrow because we're going to have a meeting. I want to make sure the board of directors agrees with us. And then she asked a question that I hadn't expected. It just kind of blew me out of the water. She said, okay, how would you market this book? What are you going to do with it if you had it? Well, at the time, the way that books are marketed is that the publisher basically could buy advertising space in the bookstore through what they called cooperative marketing, and you could buy, for example, make a display in the front of the bookstore, behind the glass in the window. You could make a display behind the counter at the bookstore, or you could put a display on the main floor. And the best time of the year for a middle grade book is right around Christmas, because grandparents in particular want their grandkids to read, and they like to pick up a book to give to the kids for Christmas. And so I said, okay, I think what we need to do is buy the front of the store, behind the counter, create a maximum end cap somewhere, which is a great big display in the middle of the floor, and put that out during the months of November and December. Well, to do that was a huge amount of money. You're talking $2.5 million or so. And she said, we're a small publisher. We've never been able to get the front of a bookstore, to do that for the chains, because Barnes and Noble and Borders would do that, but you have to pay them a bunch of money to get that kind of advertising. And anyway, she said, how would you approach them, to even get that? And I said, okay, who's your sales manager? And she said, oh, Mark. And I said, I said, okay, how many sales reps do you have? And she said 16. And I said, okay, I would take Mark, and I would take those 16 sales reps, and I'd send them all to the headquarters at Barnes and Noble and Borders, and let them know that you want to buy their windows. And she was like, that's crazy. They'd never even fit in the door. And I said, that's exactly what we want. We want them to know that you are crazy about this book. And so that's what they did. A couple of months later, I was at the BEA, Book Expo America, and a couple of sales reps were sitting down talking, and they were saying, did you hear this crazy stuff that these folks at this little Scholastic did? They bought up all the advertising space for November and December. And so they committed big to pushing this book. I figured it would have cost at least $8 to $10 million to advertise that book that way, because you have to actually make the physical books and put them in the bookstore and buy the window space and all of that. And anyway, that's a lot of money to invest in a book. And it was probably much more than that they were putting into it. But what I looked at was, I said, that's the investment that you've got to make in order to make this go big. And then Rowling really added fuel to the fire, because this was in October of '98. Well, by October of '99, she had the next two books in the series were turned into the publisher, so that they were just really kicking it. You've heard of rapid release among marketers nowadays, people in the book industry trying to get books out as fast as they can on Kindle so that they can build a huge audience. Well, Rowling did that. And by the time that we got to the third book, all of a sudden we're getting all of this free advertising, because we've got kids going to the stores for Harry Potter rallies, and it's getting on the news and this kind of thing. So we're getting all of this word of mouth and all of that earned advertising, and it just took off. So it's now the largest book in the history of books, 130 million copies sold, and that's still quite a bit bigger than Lord of the Rings or a couple of others that are right up there. So anyway, that's kind of how it took off.
I have so many questions for you. First of all, thank you for sharing the story. But before I do that, looking at Brian, I just kind of imagined Brian has some ideas after listening to that, and I was wondering if we can start with him, maybe.
Well, I was just curious. So I Googled how many copies of Harry Potter sold, and it says 500 million. So it's a lot of books, and
130 million of the first book, from what I understand.
Fair enough. That very well could be. I want to just really quickly mention how I heard about Harry Potter. I was in State College, PA. I was visiting a friend who had to work that day. I bought the USA Today, opened it up. It was a Wednesday. a two-page article about Harry Potter, and that the fourth book was launching on Saturday. I bought the first book because I just read a two-page USA Today article about Harry Potter. This would be earned media, I would suppose, and it sounded fantastic. So I bought the book, started reading it. She got home from work. Her friends had planned a party for me, and we went to the party. The folks were drinking, having a good time. I was meeting all of her friends, and I said, do you think anyone would mind if I went in the corner? I've only got 50 pages left of this book. And she said, it's your party. So I did. And then I bought book 2 on Thursday. I finished reading book 3 on Saturday, and then bought book 4. So I'm a big Harry Potter fan. As far as the book business, yes, it has changed drastically from back in those days, because people aren't, when I say people, authors, they don't need to be in bookstores. Being in a bookstore is a vanity play in this day and age, because most people that consume 4 to 5 books a week, and those are your avid readers, they're consuming through a service like Kindle Unlimited, which is the Netflix of books. And so the marketing needs to be towards where the readers are at, and they're in Kindle Unlimited. And this is not me saying Amazon is better than iBooks or Google Play or Kobo. It's just that the reality are my friends making $100,000 a month as indie authors, and you've not heard of any of them. That's the point. The industry is so big. I have 12 friends. I'm not one of them, but I have 12 author friends who make in excess of $100,000 every single month. And I could tick their names off. I won't, because I've just shared their personal data, but you haven't heard of any of them. I could walk down the street and pick one of them to say, hey, have you heard of so-and-so? No. But the market's that big, and they've tapped into the volume readers. So it's an entirely different game as far as marketing today versus back in the day, because when Harry Potter first came out, Kindle didn't exist.
That's right.
So I had a question going back to what you said about Scholastic not being in bookstores. Growing up, Scholastic was in all the schools. It was the book fairs. Why does Scholastic not have that reach, and what led to that?
Well, that was pretty easy. I mean, Scholastic started up as a actually, I believe it was kind of a book club, I guess is what they called it. Okay. That meant that they would come and they would advertise to schools, and you would order the books, and they would appear in your mailbox a few weeks later. Okay.
It was the best day of the month.
Yes, exactly. And so what would happen was that was the way they did it. And then they started organizing the school book fairs. And at the school book fairs, a couple times a year, they would come in and they would bring in a bunch of books, and they had a huge number that they would bring in, a nice selection. And the librarians, for every book that a parent bought, the librarians would get a donation and say, okay, you get 20% off of a book for your library or something like that. And so the librarians could basically get free books for the school library. So the parents felt good about donating to the school library. They got books for their kids. Your kid became popular because they had all of the right books and stuff like that. And you have to understand that that peer pressure and whatnot that comes with buying the right book is a very real thing. I did a talk at a bookstore years ago where I went and talked to a bunch of kids in an elementary school, and there were 1,008 kids in the elementary school. I sold 932 books in 2 days just for the kids who bought them from that elementary school. You couldn't be cool if you didn't have my book. That's really what it came down to. So sometimes when that happens, and it happened with Harry Potter, okay, with Harry Potter, you couldn't be cool if you hadn't read Harry Potter. And that is when a book really takes off. Most of the time, people are, they're at the water cooler and everybody says, oh, you have to read this book. You have to read this book. Well, people get tired of being left out of the conversation, so they go read the dang book, even if they've never read a book in their life.
So to build on that, are there special marketing tricks that you use when marketing to kids because they're not the ones with the money?
Absolutely. One of my students is a fellow named Brandon Mull. And years ago, I basically, after I did that little thing where I sold my 1,000 books, I was teaching at a writing workshop. And I said, you could turn yourself into a New York Times bestseller very easily if you would go to schools and you would talk to every kid in the school. You'd basically go do go talk, give a talk in public. You have the mothers there. You talk about writing. You talk about your book a little bit, and then you have a book signing later on that night, and you give kids a little coupon and let them come in. Anyway, so we did that, and Brandon went to the same school that I had gone to and sold my books, and he had the same treatment. The only difference was he was really prepared. When I went and did my book signing, I had 200 people lined up around the block. Well, he had 200 people lined up around the block, but he also had a movie camera. And so he took movie cameras and they put it on the nightly news. All of a sudden, every bookstore in the state wanted to have him at their store and do a big sale like that. And that really went viral. But the point of it was I told Brandon, I said, look, if you go to 6 different regions around the country, there's 6 different book selling regions, and you do this same technique so that you build an audience in each region. By the time that you get to the 3rd book in your series, you ought to be a New York Times bestseller. I'll bet you could hit up at number 5. On his 3rd book, he hit at number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list. On his 4th book, he hit at number 1, and he he got his first multi-million-dollar contract on that book. So it took him roughly about 3 years in order to reach that spot. But if you knew that you could go to work at a job and that by working hard for 3 years you could become a multimillionaire, you'd probably put your heart into it. And that's what he did.
Greg, I'm wondering what, forgive me if I forgot the name, what Slinky thinks of all of this. And you're muted, of course, just so you know, before you even start answering that. I love Zoom, don't you all?
I think Slinky is probably sleeping through it and, and thinking, let them worry about that. I'm more interested in the mice.
Yeah, Slinky left. But not when Dave was speaking. He left when we were talking before.
He slinked off?
Ooh, you went there. So what do you think, Craig? Looking at all these different concepts, it all comes back to what you said in the beginning about kind of creating a brand and individualizing, or what Dave did, what his friend Brandon did, is all going out there, being in front of people, in that case in person, but you can do it in other ways, online, by writing articles, all kinds of things. You get out there and you become someone. It's like when we were still having science fiction conventions, you went at a lot of authors, you went and you were on panels, if you could get invited to be on panels, and there are ways to do that. And if you were interesting and entertaining, people wanted to buy your book, even if they'd never heard of you before, because you were interesting and entertaining. And maybe they had met you. So now this was an author you met. All of that worked to increase sales. And they told their friends. It always comes down to, is the movie a good movie? Is the book a good book? We're talking about how you get, in the case of movies, how you get butts in seats the first weekend. After that, the work has to sell itself.
future weekends to sell for me to tell my friends I love this book, I have to like the book, not just know about the book.
Excellent. Dave, could you talk a bit about reading the audience and what that means and how to, target and shift your approach, I guess?
Well, when I'm talking to an audience, especially when you're reading to kids, with my kids' books, I like to have a lot of humor in them. And there's humor that's aimed at different audiences. There's some jokes that the first graders get. There's some that the third graders get. And I used to watch as I was reading. I would just see which grade levels were laughing, who was getting my jokes. And it was fun because sometimes I would be...
Dave, I'm sorry. I'll cut you off right there, right in the middle of the story, because I know that you gave them pizza.
I did. I actually have done that too. No, I did. I did have, but one of the things that I saw was that as you would do that, the kids would love certain jokes, but the teachers loved other jokes. And I had one teacher that was sitting there laughing so hard she fell out of her chair, and it was just funny because the first graders were like hee hee, and the third graders were ha ha, and then the teacher's just cracking up because she got the multiple levels of humor that the other kids just didn't see.
Well, I guess that the question often comes in writing workshops and other places like that. I want to write what I want to write, but I want to write to market so I can sell. And I keep wondering about, first of all, how would you know what's the market? And I'm really happy that Brian is one coming up next because that will be interesting. But how do you know, Dave, what's the market you're writing to and how to adjust to it?
Well, that's an interesting question as a writer when you're writing a book. You probably don't have a bunch of people who are reading your book. Most of the time you're sitting here writing and you just sort of have to trust your gut instinct. And I think that most of the very best writers write for themselves and then go out and find a market,
Are you seriously telling me that the best advice is follow your dreams?
Something along that line, yeah. I hate to be cliche.
And look
but there are things like...
I said, and look for the pizza-loving market.
There you go. But there are things that you can do, like going on to Wattpad or something along that line, where there are people who will read it for free, and you can look at the record of when did people stop reading and that kind of thing, and find out just how people really are reacting to your book. And so there is a way to get some demographics on it now, which we couldn't do even 20 years ago.
So aren't there some concerns about publishing rights? If you put it up on Wattpad, doesn't that affect sales sometimes?
With some publishers, yes. There are some publishers who don't want to see it there or anywhere else. They want to have a virgin market that nobody has ever seen or read this book, and surprise them with it. Other places recognize that it's not important. One author I know puts it this way. He says, buying a book is simply a record of the story. It's a keepsake. And so a lot of people, if they love a story, they'll go buy the book because they love the story, not because they want to read it. It's because I have read that book. And so it doesn't seem to hurt sales for an awful lot of different types of books.
And this, first of all, thank you, Dave, again, as always, and you're always welcome back. This will be your third time now, second time, I can't even count.
Yep.
Appreciate that. And we will try to also make sure that Ed, Craig, and Brian will want to come back, but we'll see about it. You're already a captive panelist. And on that note, it's a good opportunity for us to shift to Brian. I would like to introduce him first. It's not easy to introduce Brian because it truly is a leader, whether it's in writing, in helping writers, in understanding marketing, in numbers. He's shifted the way I look at the world. So Brian D. Meeks, is a full-time author with 19 novels and 5 nonfiction books. He coaches writers on the art of marketing, and he has over 11,000 members in his 2 Facebook groups. Hi, Brian. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I'm so pleased to be here. Even though I didn't have my camera on earlier, I was listening in to the other panelists because I was one of those kids that grew up on Star Wars. And in fact, I had to look it up because I couldn't remember the week Star Wars came out. So I used the Google on May 25th, 1977. Well, because of that, what I do remember is that I went to Star Wars in its 53rd week at the mall in Ames, Iowa. I did not go to it before that. So I didn't go to it for the first time until the end of May 1978 because I didn't like the poster. That was it.
Didn't like the poster.
Did not like the poster. All my friends were nuts about Star Wars. I had a paper route. I saved up my money. I was very much into baseball cards. I went in the 53rd week and then went 6 more nights over the next 10 days. I still have Star Wars character, the figurines. I have.
But do you have the poster?
No, I still never liked the poster, but I became a rabid fan. I was just looking up some of the other Star Wars books I've read. The one was Splinter of the Mind's Eye. I couldn't remember the others, but Star Wars was a huge part of my childhood. So listening to all the talk about that was a joy. And I honestly, it is interesting that I became an author because on January 2nd, 2010, in the afternoon, I hated writing. I had never had a writing course, and my perception of writing was that one only did it when they were being punished by their boss. Usually, write a report or something like that. There was no joy for me in writing because I had this horrific 8th grade English teacher who I simply referred to as the devil, and she had beat any possible love of writing out of me. Well, on that day, January 2nd, the bowl game that I was interested in watching didn't kick off for a while, so I was wandering around the World Wide Web, and I found this place called Blogger. Well, though I didn't like writing, I was bored, and the day before, something interesting had happened in my quest to learn woodworking. Every woodworker first project is build a workbench because you need it for your other projects. And I was learning how to do that. There's an old adage that says, measure twice, cut once. Well, there should be an asterisk by that because when I got up on the morning of January 2nd, 2010, I had 4 legs that I had measured twice and cut once of 3 different lengths. Because apparently if one is measuring while watching college football, it doesn't matter how many times you measure, it may not be accurate. And that was the gist of my post. There we go. Morgan just did a tape measure. And so I thought it was funny. I wrote this post, and then later on, after I was done with that, I was at a forum, and we're talking about marketing and word of mouth and different ways to reach people. Well, it was a woodworking forum called Lumberjocks. I believe it's still out there. And for an hour, I just read these posts by woodworkers who were brilliant at their craft. They were doing everything from music boxes to reproductions of Georgian furnitures. One guy even you can buy lumber that has been dredged up from a river that is from the correct years. And so he was doing reproductions that if carbon dated would have shown they came from the Georgian era. It was fascinating. Well, it was time for my football game, and so I quickly signed up. And when I did, a button appeared and it said blog. Well, I had already blogged, and it was about woodworking. So I pasted that in there and I went on my way. The next day when I returned, 300 people had read my post. 25 had left comments, and it was all along the lines, this is hilarious. I've been here 5 years. I can't wait for your next post. And I started blogging every day from there. And I did that from January 2nd all the way through March 26th of 2016. I blogged every day. And through my blog, I wrote 6 novels where I would just write them one chapter, not every day. Sometimes I was writing about woodworking, but when I needed something to do, I would write a new chapter. And my Henry Wood Detective Agency series is about a detective who likes woodworking. So that's how I got my first 4 novels. And I had 4 before I published the first one. The point.
No, the point.
I was going to say the point.
No, when you say the point, I was like, we are all into this and listening to you, and we're all truly. Sorry, I'm talking to you. Wait a second. So we're all listening to you, and we're focusing on you. And then you say, but the point is, wait, did you just waste 5 minutes of my time?
Well, the point of this whole story is that my background is not as a writer. One doesn't need to have a degree in literature or creative writing or English to do this. One can learn. And am I a better writer today than I was back in 2010? Absolutely. And the last book I wrote was better than the 12th book I wrote, which is better than the 7th book I wrote. We live in an era that is the absolute best for people out there listening that have the dream of writing that book. They have a story to tell. And that's most of the 11,000 people in those groups are people that are following their dreams. There aren't any rules. Anybody can get involved. And because of self-publishing, because it's now a viable career path, I know many, literally hundreds of authors who make their living writing words. And that's a wonderful way to live.
So I have a question going off of that. It sounds like you partially got into writing because of the external feedback, because of the external validation.
Yes. Ding, 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 ding. I hated writing. A bunch of people said, you're good at writing. I felt warm and fuzzy. That's the story.
So how do you balance when things aren't well received or you're not getting that external validation? And how do you keep your self-worth from being based on your blog hits?
Self-worth? What's that?
I have one solution, and this is what I do when I get a 1-star review, because we all get 1-star reviews, and sometimes they hurt our feelings. So I go to Amazon, I look up the worst writer in the history of books. Now, you may like Old Man and the Sea, but Ernest Hemingway is an atrocious writer. He's a C- student at best. And if you go read his 1-star reviews, some of the finest literature ever produced are the 1-star reviews tearing apart Hemingway. He's won a Pulitzer, and you should read them. They are brutal. It is, and I've read all of Hemingway's books. I have his collection of letters back there because I wrote a young adult, and the title is Killing Hemingway. Now, it's just a metaphor for this story in the first 2 acts, and then the character gets to know a professor who loves Hemingway, and that sort of is the premise for the 3rd act, because our hero hates Hemingway. And so I've read everything about Hemingway. He's horrible. And when I feel bad, I go read the 1-star reviews tearing apart an author that many people love, but he's won a Pulitzer, and there's still a lot of people that think his writing is rubbish, myself included. And so that's every author I know has a different way of dealing with it, at least the successful ones, because that is part of the game. You're going to get told something doesn't work, or somebody sends you an email, you know what, in the 3rd chapter you spelled the T-E-H. Are you an idiot? Well, no.
Well, debatable.
Well,
no, I'm kidding. Look, seriously, you're one of the people I most like to listen to when it comes to all of this. You're a data person. I'm a techie. Yeah. We love data. You bring down that audience selection, the ability to write to audience, building up your audience, marketing, advertising, all of that. You can give a 10-hour talk on that right now.
Yes.
And yes,
I
true.
can talk for 10. In fact, I was asked to speak at a Romance Writers of America club meeting in Houston, and I got to speak at the Houston Space Station. They have meeting rooms there, and so there were 30 or 40 romance writers. And when they asked me to come several months before, they said, "You would be our speaker. Can you talk for 4 hours?" And I said, "Yes, I can." Now, I've done a lot of conferences. I've never spoken for 4 hours, but I knew I could, and I went down there and
So tell me, Brian, let's start from not necessarily data, although I would love to take us there. When we talked about your bio, for example, as an author, obviously you are very sensitive to text, you're very sensitive to words, but you specifically often speak of copywriting. Now, it changed your life or professional capabilities.
It absolutely did. Copywriting and prose, they're words, but they are so different in their execution, because a beautifully crafted sentence may have it has a cadence, it has a music to it. When you're reading beautiful prose, you're almost listening to a symphony. And I mean, that may sound like hyperbole, but I remember an English author, and I can't remember his name. I was trying to before I was the speaker here, but he had a quote. They asked him about.
I know that one. It's Shakespeare, right?
No, he's more modern. But he was asked by the interviewer, "What will your life be like the day after you stop writing?" And he said to effect, "I will spiral into a pit of despair so profound as to be indistinguishable from perfect bliss." And that is brilliant writing. It had a visceral feeling for me because it immediately made me hate him with a white hot passion. I'm an optimist, and so somebody reveling in despair as bliss, and I went from, I simultaneously was awed by the brilliance of that sentence and the visceral reaction it had within me. That is the power of prose. The power of copywriting is that people who are reading copy, they're in the Facebook mindset. Most listeners are on Facebook, and if you see a post by a friend with a picture of a puppy and 15 lines of information about the puppy, nobody reads it. But I can write 500 to 1,500 words in a Facebook post and get 300 to 600 comments, 1,600 likes and loves over a massive post. And it's not the word count, it's the presentation, it's the hooks, it's the short paragraph, linking up short paragraphs with open loops, which are all copywriting techniques. It's different than prose. And the big difference for authors is you need to master both, because prior to learning copywriting, because I was doing Amazon ads, it would take me paying for 30 clicks to get a new reader. After copywriting, the month after I went down that rabbit hole, it took me 12. Now, I'm a data guy. I had literally, at the time, I think I had 500,000 clicks worth of data on over 100 million impressions. So I had statistically significant data across, at the time, I written in 5 different genres. So I had multiple genres, statistically significant data. And as I rewrote each description, they dropped from 1 in 30 to 35 down to 1 in 12. That was 4 or 5 years ago. In that time, I've improved as a copywriter, and now my descriptions convert at 1 in 8 to 1 in 10. And I just had a gentleman who is a client. I wrote his description back in February. At the time, he was getting 400 Amazon clicks. His conversion rate was 1 in 35, somewhere in there. So he was getting approximately 12 readers for 400 clicks. We rewrote his description, and over the next 400 clicks, he got 50 readers.
Interesting. So I keep wondering as you're speaking, looking at what was done with Star Wars in the 70s, and now Dave spoke of Harry Potter and trying to get it in front of as many people as possible. When I see your posts sometimes, I notice that I'm drawn in, but I also notice that I'm drawn into... There are a few things that are truly attractive to me in the world when I have a professional hat on, and one of them is feeling that the person comes from the trenches. They know what they're talking about. They have been there with me, and I can trust them on it. And I don't. What does the line? Does actually knowing your stuff, putting the data out there, help you, or do you think you could have done the same? It sounds like a silly question, but do you think you would have done the same just by your marketing techniques?
Well, whether I had ever mentioned the data publicly or not wasn't the point. I'm a data analyst. I'm a reasonable writer. This is a point that I think those out there who are interested in maybe writing books should remember. Not only did I not have any training in writing, my books, my fiction at least, for the most part, the book ones are 4.1 books as far as the rankings. My author friends, I have many, many author friends that are 4.5, 4.6, 4.7 on their first book. Now, books 2 through whatever, those are always high because you only get the people that like the first book reading the second one, so they're biased and it skews the numbers up. But on book ones, I'm only an average writer. But I'm an above average data analyst. I'm a great data analyst. And that's my point, is that whether I had ever shared the numbers or not, nobody calculated conversion rate before I wrote about it in Mastering Amazon Ads. I mean, that's now a standard thing that is preached because none of the people listening, nobody gets data analytics training. It's not part of high school.
Listening to it almost feels like we would need... Morgan, do you feel we need to be experts on this as writers? I mean, where would you take this?
I think if you're doing your own marketing, that you definitely probably should. And if you're going with a more traditional publishing method, that if you're not getting the support from your publishing house and need to do that bit on your side, that it's definitely helpful. Although I am curious how much of the improved click-through is from the copywriting and how much is from like Facebook ads sending it to people who already responded and were already an audience, because Facebook's ways are...
100% of the improvement is from the copy, because I mean, and that this is, you have to understand, I have written 400 to 500 descriptions. Now, I don't have data from all those authors, but from all of the ones that I have, they're all running Amazon ads. And so the data that I'm getting, it is something that when one does an analysis, and I don't need to go too deep in the woods, but you look at a before period, 45 days. You look at an after period. You look at the number of clicks you had. You look at the number of clicks you had in the after period. And then you divide those by the number of new readers. It's incredibly clear, and there's no other things that could skew the data. It's only when you only change one thing. Now, of course, one can change a cover. Covers don't convert. Covers change click-through rate. So if you have a poor cover, when you're running ads, you won't get as many good clicks as an A+ cover. And so I rewrote the description for Battlefield Earth, L. Ron Hubbard's book. It was the first traditionally published book that I did, and I did that at the beginning of the year. And you have to understand the traditional publishers, all of the big five, none of them have data analysts. They have accountants, but they don't do the data analytics that I'm doing. And they wrote me 3 weeks later and said, without any change, and this is a book, I don't know what year Battlefield Earth was published, but they manage his estate, all of his books.
A couple weeks ago.
It's been a while, but the point is they saw an instant improvement, and the only change was the copy. So
okay, this leads into my next question. So
Sure.
this Despite the stereotype of the writer as an introvert, with the current market and the situation, does it make it easier? Is it more targeted for extroverts to succeed because you have to put yourself out there and market yourself and market your books? And, you know, even traditionally published authors need to lean in these days.
Maybe, but I'm thinking about my friends that are making extraordinary amounts of money. And I'm not just talking about those 12 making the 7 figures, but you know, somebody making 15, 20,000 a month is still pretty good. And I do not think that there are more extroverts than there are introverts. Simply, and of course that data is skewed because your point, I think, is good that many, many authors are introverts. But the ones that send me a message or will chat on Zoom and they tell me, I read your book, it made me cry. They're talking about the ads book. It made me cry because I hate math. But I decided I love my books more. So I went back and reread it, did the math instead of just glossing over the math, realized it wasn't so hard, and then started doing the math, and I just quit my day job. And so people that were making less than $1,000 a month doing it part-time were able to get to 5 figures because of the math and understanding the decision making. And that's where people go wrong. And I don't want to make it sound like you need to have a master's degree in math. The math that I do in the book business is 5th grade math. It's division, subtraction. It isn't a master's degree in statistics. And once you have some basic metrics, the lifetime value of your series, the read through of your books that relates to lifetime value, the conversion rate that we've just talked about, if you know your conversion rate is 1 in 10, well, you don't need to do anything other than estimate, well, I know my conversion rate is 1 in 10. That's easy math. I know that with the read-through, the lifetime value of my 6-book series is $13. Not everybody reads from book 1 to 2, but most of those that do read on to the end. And I've calculated I have $13 of value when I get a new reader. Well, let's say you're paying 50 cents a click. It will cost you $5, 5 times 10, to get that new reader. And they're worth $13. So it's not super computer rocket scientist stuff. And the people that are introverts or math phobes that get over that, they're the ones that go on and quit their day job. Did that answer your question?
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? I've already seen the little sign that says I'm nearing the end of my time.
Well, Brian, honestly, you're the numbers expert. You're essentially, in my book, the e-publishing expert. Okay, whether it's in you're welcome. I think you know that about yourself. So my question for you is, listening to everything that we were talking about as you were in and out, about Star Wars, about Harry Potter, the world has changed. In what ways do you think people who are doing marketing today need to realize that change? Where is that change?
Well, I have a great example for that as well, because again, I am biased. I love Harry Potter. I love Star Wars. I'm a complete fanboy about both of those. But I know that J.K. Rowling at age 9 hadn't made that much money. I don't think Lucas had probably made that much money at age 9. But do you know who the number 1 YouTuber was in 2019? It was an 8-year-old. I think he's 9 now, named Ryan. And I looked and did the math, and back of the envelope sort of estimate. Ryan is 9 years old, and I estimate that he has, over the lifetime of Ryan's World on YouTube, made approximately $60 million. Who knows what he will do by the time he reaches age 42, which is when I published my first book.
Blow absolutely all his money and try to live off of what he did when he was 9?
I don't think so. This kid, if you've ever seen his videos, he strikes me as one of those kids that he's incredibly bright. I think he'll be one of those kids that graduates high school at 14 or 15. And I mean, right now,
half of those burn out, and how much of that is the parents?
I have no idea, but you know what? If he burns out today and puts that $60 million in the stock market, he's not going to spend it all. The point is not about this Ryan kid, because there's PewDiePie, there's Mr. Beast, there are countless YouTubers out there who are making millions. Some of them are making tens of millions of dollars via that outlet. And so you asked about what's new today. Well, I don't think YouTube is used very well by the book industry. I've researched it quite a bit. That's something that I'm going to start doing a bit with and see if one can capture the imaginations of those who read. Now, it's been shown that 53% of adults, once they finish their schooling, never read a book the rest of their lives. But you know what? That 47% of us that love reading, we read lots of books. And we watch movies. And we watch YouTube. So there's something, I believe, and somebody can tell me if I've gotten this number wrong. I believe it's 300 hours of new content is uploaded on YouTube every minute of the day. This is where the eyeballs are at. And so that's an area where I think if Harry Potter were starting today, they might consider YouTube, because I don't believe it's being done very well by authors at present.
So as you speak, on the one hand, and I could see Dave, nodding like this, I want to say, wow, that is true. Nobody is using YouTube the right way. And then I was thinking of some of my usage.
I wanted to cut in. I think there is a huge audience, but it's very niche. I think there's the booktubers, and some of them are doing very well for themselves. And
I don't doubt it. But then again, like if you look at this, going out there and reading just doesn't really appeal to a lot of people in the fast economy.
It doesn't need to be reading.
That's not what booktube is.
It could just be authors. Okay. You earlier, and I forget which panelist you were talking with, but one of them mentioned that when he spoke, people wanted to come and hear him and meet him and learn about him, the author. So is that an opportunity where it's simply an author talking about their lives? There's a bass player, the guitar, bass, named Davey 504. I'm not musical. I don't play any instruments. I can't carry a note. I am not his target audience. But Davey 504 has approximately 7 million followers, and I've watched at least 60 hours of his videos. So he was able to get a regular consumer of his content because it's entertaining. Authors, we tell stories. There's no reason we can't be entertaining on YouTube. And you know what? At the end of the day, now I haven't done this yet. I haven't cracked it. But I think somebody will. If you're entertaining and people like listening to you, when they get done and they've watched all your videos, maybe they'll go read a book.
I'm thinking back to Harlan Ellison with the Sci-Fi Channel news thing that happened in the 90s when he would come in and diss everybody and call everybody.
That's a great example.
But the thing is, looking at YouTube, looking at all these people out there, as you said, it needs to be cracked in a way. I don't know. I mean, I have never heard of BookTube. Maybe Morgan can step in here. But I think about Twitter. And this may be something that a lot of people will not appreciate. But I've seen tens, if not hundreds of thousands of writers on Twitter. And everybody gets on Twitter because writers are told they should be on Twitter. And then I see all these writers following each other in, I will not mention the term I want to use, but it's a swamp. And I don't think most of these people will actually read them ever. So right now there is an opportunity. People have not cracked it. They need to take a risk. They need to go out there and try to do something with YouTube. And then it will, once it's done, there is a short amount of time where it's that effective, where somebody can really reach the top before it becomes everybody doing the same thing.
Well,
how do you?
That's a valid point. Whoever is the first author to get 5 million YouTube followers, they will have an advantage over the people that come later on. Absolutely. But it's just a platform that an author can get into. They can create a book trailer. They can do it themselves, whereas they can't afford to run an ad on network TV.
So they
And
would not
so-
be book writers anymore. They would be writers going for that kind of medium.
Well, I think they could be both, because one could certainly keep writing their novels, keep doing what they had been doing in the past with whether it's Facebook marketing and Facebook. And I didn't mean to imply that Facebook wasn't a great way to market books. It was just in response to the question. My data was not based on Facebook ads. It was Amazon ads. The point being is that there's the new things that are coming up. Twitch, live streaming, video game playing. That's a new thing. Do I think that we're going to get live streaming authors reading their books? I mean, I've done a little bit of it. It hasn't taken off. But authors are, to a much lesser extent, can be celebrities. And if you can connect with your readership and you have 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 followers on YouTube that are rabid and loyal, well, then you can say, hey, you know what? I wasn't going to tell anybody this, but I've been writing a new book in the such and such series. It's a prequel. It's a little off from the side. It's from a minor character that a lot of you love. And I'll tell you more about it next week. And start building up that anticipation like they did with Star Wars, showing it on the screens. And you do that for a year, you could build up a ferocious appetite among that tiny, tiny group that adore you.
So some of the author tubers and booktubers that I follow, like Kim Chance, has over 30,000 subscribers.
There you go.
A Booktopia has 359,000. So they're niche, but people in those communities are definitely there, and they definitely. I've got another on my feed with 82,000. You know, they're out there, and people are using it. I just don't know that people outside of their genre, their market, may not be as aware, but people are definitely using YouTube and definitely having a lot of success with that.
Yeah, 359,000. I just looked up Booktopia. That's a lot of people. And I would estimate that Booktopia, because it's typically women earn more on their ads than men. And so 42,000 times 3, I would estimate Booktopia just from her channel has earned over 6 figures. If it had been a guy, it probably would have been closer to 70,000, but she's probably around 150 to 160,000 in revenue just from her channel. And she's been working on it since 2013. So it is still very much in its infancy.
Definitely. But people are there and definitely pushing forward the market and the audience.
Which brings the question as far as if you had written another J.K. Rowling, how do you reach the kids out there? Maybe you reach the kids through a Twitch channel, because there are a lot of gamers, professional gamers. I used to live on the Strip in Las Vegas, and one of the big arenas was just down the street from me at Luxor. The gamers that are professionals making, if they play for a team, they make worst case scenario $100,000 a year, are in the 16 to 18-year-old range, a few 14-year-olds. But these kids then have Twitch channels, and they get massive following, and they can use it for branding. So there are all of these social media tools out there that I think the next generation who figures out the best way to take advantage of it. Now, Twitter was a great example. I've sold some books on Twitter, but not probably in the last 5 years, because Twitter has gone from a place where it used to be community, having chats with people back and forth, to every single post has a link. Every single post is marketing, and you can't be 100% marketing.
I think this is a good moment for us to bring the rest of the crowd in. Sure. Dave was been nodding on about some things and putting his hands on his head, no, about some other things, and Craig, and kind of...
Well, I might be wrong. Dave is... I'm more than happy to listen to a rebuttal.
I don't think it was about you. I think it was about the market, but I don't want to speak for him. Dave,
I-
what about your books?
I don't actually recall what I was shaking my head against. I guess I'm shaking my head against about the ignorance of publishers who don't recognize that there's a new style of marketing coming. Publishers are used to a style of marketing where they put the books in the bookstores, people go buy them, they have no contact with the person who bought the book, they don't know if the book was read or if they liked it or anything like that. And we're moving into a time when a Twitch channel or a YouTube channel or good Facebook group is far more valuable than a publisher. And I think that Brian understands that. Most of the people that I know who are doing really well as writers right now, and when I say really well, they're getting the 5-star reviews and stuff, are data analysts who understand who their audience is, and they're writing to their audience, and they have new methods of promoting their work that are under the radar of major publishers.
Well, one of the advantages of self-publishing is the speed to market, the flexibility to write to a niche,
And the ability to get lost in the crowd.
well, one can certainly get lost in the crowd, but if you decide you want to write a romance novel, a guinea pig shifter romance novel, which I don't believe is a genre, but let's say you love guinea pigs, and you come up with the great tagline, he's the perfect boyfriend and he fits in your pocket. Well, is there a market for guinea pig shifter romance? Maybe, maybe not. But
Maybe in Japan.
The point is, if you wrote it, you would find out. If you wrote it and pitched it to the Big Five, you would not be given a chance. One of my friends, one of the romance writers who makes $1 million a year, she decided there was a genre that didn't exist and she wanted to write in it. And though she produces a romance novel every single month, she did this other thing in her own genre, and it doesn't make near the money that her romance books do. But you know what? It makes more money than most authors because she now at this point is very good with the marketing and her fan base is willing to try this crazy thing that she came up with. But if she was going traditionally, they wouldn't let her waste her time on a project that gave her a lot of joy. And so she doesn't need the money from that, but she did it. And that's the beauty of this. And somebody mentioned right to market. Chris Fox is an author friend of mine who has a very successful book about right to market. And it doesn't mean formulaic or selling out. It means you're passionate about a genre. You then go learn more about the genre so that you can do a better job of writing a book that the readers want to read. That's what I believe right to market is about. And this is what we call dead air, which is great in the
I actually like to leave dead air out there sometimes. I can tell you that when I was a teenager, I did a little bit of radio, and even 1 second of dead air was horrible. Here, I'm willing to create that awkwardness to see who wants to step in. It's kind of like a deadlock in computing. Who's going to get into that intersection first, and you're all stuck.
There you go.
One of the things
and now everybody starts together. Go ahead, Craig.
One of the things is in publishing today, unless you're Stephen King, publishing companies are not really spending time and money marketing authors and books. If you're not one of their top selling authors, you just are out there. So whether you're self-publishing or traditionally published, you have to do the marketing of yourself and your books.
And Slinky can always come in to help you. You can create a YouTube channel of telling stories while Slinky walks around you.
For those listeners,
Jezebel.
Oh, that's Jezebel. I'm so sorry.
For those listeners that don't know, before the show, we learned our panelists' cats' names. And so, honestly, Craig, if Jezebel had a Facebook group, I would follow Jezebel. I'm just saying, if you want to market your cat, adorable, I would follow. But you made a point about the dollars that the traditional publishers are willing to spend. And it's not just that they won't spend it on you. If they do spend it on you, they're not spending their money, because your contract typically is you're getting paid on net. So if they do put your face on a bus at a cost of, I don't know how much a face on a bus costs, but let's say it's $10,000, they're going to recoup back that $10,000 before you see a penny. So when you imagine, if you're an author or an aspiring author who thinks, oh, well, if I get lucky and they spend all this money on me, well, they're spending your money, because
10 minutes.
So I've got a question on this. Is it detrimental to authors who are doing their own marketing not to have a cat?
Yes. Yeah.
Or
yeah, there's no way.
Or a guinea
You
pig.
need a cat or a guinea pig. You know what's really nice is the hedgehog. The hedgehog is adorable. If you don't follow Rick the Hedgehog on Facebook, you are missing out on some of the cutest videos.
I think I'm going to experiment with my own writing and get an ant farm, maybe. See if that works.
There you go.
Boone did well with ravens.
I keep getting told that the iguana market is highly underserved.
that could be.
More iguanas.
People love pets. And though we're all sort of joking, Grumpy Cat made $1 million a year as an icon. And so it is absolutely something. People, the authors that know me, I mean, I've known David for a little while. The authors that know me know that part of my brand is guinea pigs. I don't own a guinea pig. I just think they're adorable. And back on Twitter in the early days, I was on Twitter the week it came out of beta. A guinea pig followed me. And I looked at the guinea pig's name, and it was this long-haired brown guinea pig. His name was Billy, but his Twitter handle was Biggius Piggius. And Billy the guinea pig, of course, I'm going to follow back a Twitter handle called Biggius Piggius. And I did, and we started chatting. Well, because of those interactions, within a month, I was following and was followed by 50 guinea pigs. And these are folks that adore their guinea pigs, and they tweet as the guinea pig, talking about vegetables, for instance. That's kind of what, and napping and getting their cage cleaned. And Billy had a blog where he wrote about his humans travel business. They book people from Australia to Africa for safaris. And so I got to know Billy. They were the first person other than my parents to buy a copy of Henry Wood. I shipped it to Australia. They took pictures of the guinea pigs with the book. I put that on my blog. And I've used that in my course. I have guinea pigs, and it's something that I like. It makes part of the marketing of Brian Meeks with my nonfiction. It lets me do fun things. So I use guinea pigs all the time. And if you have a passion and you can work it in, maybe you like music, maybe you played the French horn. It's something that you can get excited about other than just, I write these books. It's an element that lets people get to know you. And when you can connect with an audience, we've been talking about fiction. Well, there may be folks out there that want to write nonfiction books. And I've experienced in that as well. As I built 2 Facebook groups up to, they have about 11,000 people in total. Now, some people are part of both groups, so that's not unique numbers. But when I built the first Facebook group, and this is using social media, I launched the group on February 24th, 2017, Mastering Amazon Ads, an author's guide -beta. It's still there. And I told people, I said, I'm writing this book about Amazon ads, and there wasn't much out there at the time on Amazon ads. I'm going to write it and share the chapters as I'm creating them with the group. You'll get the stuff early, but I want you all to promise me that on the day that I launch, you'll buy the book, and it's going to be priced at $9.99, and they were all fine with that. And so from February 24th through July 15th, the day it launched, I was spending close to 8 to 10 hours a day, every day. I took 2 days off during that period, every day interacting with the group. If somebody had a question and I couldn't explain it to their satisfaction in the group, I'd get on a phone call, or I'd set up a GoToWebinar. And that's how I built my group. And that's again, using social media for that other channel, the nonfiction. And so I just want to say I've really enjoyed talking with you all today. This has been fun.
I had one more follow-up question to that. I've heard that, teens and kids aren't really using Facebook. They're doing TikTok and Instagram and everything like that.
Sure.
So building groups is harder in Instagram and that sort of thing. How do you change your approach when your audience isn't on the platform that you're comfortable with?
Well, honestly, I've never used TikTok. I'm familiar with it. I've done a little bit with Twitch, but not with the idea of trying to reach readers, just because I like learning about this new stuff. So yes, there may not be groups out there. It may be harder. Maybe I know a young person that's done well with Goodreads. Goodreads scares a lot of authors because there's so many harsh reviews from Goodreads. But I know this younger woman who has figured out a way to connect with her younger readers through Goodreads. So I can't give you a playbook necessarily for the 14 to 22-year-old age demographic, but it's likely something that's new out there or is coming. I agree. It's hard to do groups on those platforms. I don't have a good answer. Sorry, the answer is I don't know.
And that's always good to know that you're comfortable saying when you don't know something. That's much better than the opposite.
Well, I mean, I can guess and I can theorize, but just like with YouTube, what I was telling the folks there about YouTube is a theory. And it's a theory that I'm working to prove or disprove. When I talk about conversion rate, I have hundreds of thousands of data points backing it up. And so that's no longer theory. When I talk about pricing of a book, don't ever price your book at 99 cents is wrong for 99% of the population. 1% of the population should be pricing their books at 99 cents, but most should be pricing them at $4.99. I could talk for an hour just about that, but it is based on my degree in economics, actual data, actual math that led me to those conclusions. And so I can give theory, I can give proven stuff, and sometimes I can just give a best estimate.
Thank you. So, any last thoughts? Let's go to Dave. You're on mute. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. As far as reaching young audiences, I don't know what the platform is going to be 3 months from now. And so when it comes to reaching them, it sort of behooves you as an author to go master them as fast as you can, or when the time arises. That's really all it comes down to.
Yeah, I agree with Dave. If you don't know the platform, if you don't know how to reach out to it, find some friend of yours who does, and have them give you instruction on what they're doing, how it works, and how you can maybe get into it.
I want to, at this stage, thank everybody. I really appreciate when we're able to share and save these stories of the past, of how things happened, and kind of like the MBA stories. They seem to take a story, take it out of proportion, cheat on what they're actually saying, and then you have a story for the coming ages for young students to learn and be inspired by. And I find that we don't do that enough in most other things. So Craig writing his book, Brian and Dave also willing to come in here, and of course Brian taking us through the future and his strong belief on the author. I guess I'm going to put words into your mouth. Gig economy. We are all micro entrepreneurs now.
No, I accept those words put into my
Then they're
mouth.
yours. They're yours, sir. You said them. But on that, I actually want to turn to Morgan and ask Morgan now. As I never warn people when I do this, which kind of is a bad move on me. But Morgan, you're now a writer trying to get out there and trying to spend time, and time is such a hurtful commodity. I would use that combination of words. I'm not sure that works. Dave will tell me later. How do you choose where to spend your time? If you should market, if you should write, what are the challenges you're facing?
For me, my biggest challenge is I like to call it the Little Mermaid syndrome. I want to be where the people are, even if that's not where I necessarily want to be. So I end up they say to pick 1 to 2 social medias and focus on that. And instead, I'm a blogger, vlogger, author tuber. You can get my stuff on like a email if you actually like email. I hear that some people do like stuff in their inbox, and so it's really hard to know where you should focus, and I'm really bad at picking, so I end up focusing on all of them because I don't recognize limits and I don't like sleep.
Sleep is very good for you, but never sleep. Never go there. Once you're there, enjoy it. But actually, let's pick that up as a last kind of couple minutes as we wrap this up.
Can I ask Morgan a question?
Of course.
Go for it.
Are you enjoying the process of being in all of these places? It seems like you are.
I love meeting people. I love sharing things that I learn that I find helpful and making sure that, people can learn from maybe not my mistakes, because that would require me being further along in the process than I am right now. But, to make sure that they're not misstepping and that they're following in the footsteps of those that have come before. Not that, trying new things isn't great and amazing, but you need to know what exists before you can deviate.
Absolutely. I just wanted to follow up on that and say that there are Craig Martell and Michael Ondelay constantly say there are many ways up the mountain. I have chosen, fiction-wise, to write across 6 different genres. I would have made more money writing just 19 books in the Henry Wood series. I can prove that with the math. But there's value in the joy it brings you. So I get a lot of joy of trying new things. And so I think the overwhelming flood of questions that new authors have can be debilitating. But if you are doing it in a way that makes the ride enjoyable, then that's probably a good way. Does it mean you shouldn't ask opinions and get advice? So you may think of a different way to do it better. You should absolutely do that. But
I think I want to channel a Jewish mother. Oh, beat yourself up. Beat yourself up. No, I want to channel a Jewish or Russian or whatever the current thing is today to say, and say, how dare you not be a doctor or a lawyer or whatever it is? Enjoy yourself. What is that? Dave, I want you, if you don't mind, to push back on the email thing.
Push back on what? On the email?
On saying, yes, should authors open their own newsletters and maintain that email channel?
There's no one way to do it. That's the thing. A lot of times people will say, if you want to market a book, you've got to do any 5 things will help you double your chances of becoming a bestseller. The problem is you don't know what 5 things they are. And for you, it might be a newsletter. For somebody else, it might be a Twitch channel. Somebody may actually do it with Twitter. I don't know. And I think that you should gravitate towards the things that you feel like you're good at and that you enjoy.
Yeah. If you're on a social media or a platform because you feel you should, and you feel like it's a chore, that inauthenticity is going to come across and going to drive people off. They're going to feel like they're marketed at rather than communicated with. And that, derails all the effort that you're putting into it.
I think these are smart words we can wrap up with. Thank you, Craig, so much for starting us on the path to this show. It's because of you and due to your inspiration. Brian, for coming in and putting us on the path to 2020. Dave, as always, for giving us the knowledge and the stories. And with that, next week, we're going to have an entire show on AI and ethics. And we'll see you then. Bye, everybody. And if the panelists can stay with us, we'll have a little chat. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm happy to hang out and chat. I'm a bit of a mingler.
A bit of a mingler, really. Just a bit?
Just a bit.